Thanks, Anne. And yeah, what a pleasure to be here tonight. And what's your first online meeting? I remember a few months back, a little bit towards the end of last year, when I actually moved to Bayside. And I was so excited about discovering Bayside's nature. And just around that time, I got contacted by your group, by Elizabeth, and suggested that whether I would be keen to talk to you. And now, well, we're doing it online, but it's equally exciting. Most of the photos that I will be showing you today, most of the slides are not taken in Bayside, but I'll have saved some that have been taken in Bayside towards the end. And I'm really excited to share that with you because they relate to another project that we're developing with Bayside, in Bayside and in other councils. But today I'll be talking about pollinator observatories, and I think it's a very exciting idea. I'm really happy that one of my closest colleagues in this approach is Janet Bolitho. She is here with us tonight. So hi, Janet. And yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about how we came up with this idea and how, in a way, in her own words, this idea is kind of cross-pollinating across metropolitan Melbourne because it's been uptaken in different ways by different people, by different groups. And so in its own way, the idea is evolving. So I hope you all take out something out of this idea, and maybe things will change and we can share what we all think about it tonight. So again, as Anne suggested, it would be really great if you could use the chat to comment anything or any ideas, any comments, any questions. Let's try to make it as interactive as we can, given the available technology. And on that note, and just a little bit as we can practice the chat so we all get a little bit excited about tonight's talk, I'm gonna show in the next couple of slides, it's just photos that I want you to look at. And you know, if we had been in person, maybe we would have gone outside after the workshop as we normally have with other groups. And we actually will go to a flower nearby the venue and we'll be looking for pollinators and we'll be having that kind of more mindful, easy, relaxed moment to observe the pollinators. But we can't do that tonight, so we might as well look at the photos. And yeah, if you could please use the chat, which I'm actually gonna open now, to start commenting, and I'll be monitoring the chat in this next couple of slides. I would love to hear your comments on the photos. What kind of themes you see? What comes to mind? What's your gut reaction to this image? Anything you can think. And then we can take it from there. Whether you like or not the photo, what kind of things you're seeing. Yellow, okay, good. Starting to. Hardworking bees, native bees, good observation. Lots of pollen, brilliant. Drowning in pollen. It is so much pollen, that's right, that's good. I'm glad that you've seen that. Excellent. All right, keep them coming. I'm going to move into the next one, and that's the idea. Just to become this conversation with the chat. We get familiar with it, and we actually use it as much as we can tonight. Oh, good. A question about blue-banded bees. We'll get there to a second later on in the talk. Here's the second image. And now it'd be great if you could comment maybe, what do you see different here? What's different in this image? There's a lot of things in common, but it's very similar to the yam daisy, but it's not a yam daisy, it's precisely the opposite. It's an introduced daisy. Yeah, they're out there, that's true. They're actually being used by native bees. Definitely pollinating. Well, you would hope that the bees are pollinating with that amount of pollen attached to legs. Yes, Sally, definitely a bee, a native bee, or indigenous bee. Good. Okay, good. I'm going to move into the, it could be the same species or a different one, but in any case, they're very quite related. All right. Now I have changed gears here, so to speak. There's a few elements that are quite distinctly different in this image. I wonder whether you could share with me what you think. Yeah, she's related to the blue-banded bee, but not a blue-banded bee. Yeah, she's bigger and larger, that's right. Excellent. All right, I'm gonna move into the the not that common. They're actually quite rare. Good. Okay, I'm going to move into the next one. And I believe the next one is going to elicit a different instinct, a different gut feeling. How do we feel about this image? I believe within this group, it's fair to say that everyone recognizes, or almost everyone potentially recognizes, both the plant and the insect. Excellent. Yeah, Banksia. Even from this kind of level of close-up, you can still see that it's a Banksia. Beautiful. Good. All right. Thanks for that. And thanks for your comments. I'm going to close the chat now, but feel free to just keep it going with all the slides, everything, anything you think, just pop it in there. That I'm sure will generate conversations and discussions. And well, thank you very much for sharing on that. So yeah, I normally ask which themes drew your attention the most. You've already been sharing that for those of you who have, but if not, keep that in your mind. You know, what kind of themes? I'm going to share some that I think hopefully came across. Obviously everyone was talking about pollen and bees and flowers, so pollination hopefully came to mind. But what about invasion ecology? The slides were designed in a way that there was always an interaction between something that might have been introduced, and we can think about it in Bayside or Metropolitan Melbourne. It will be the same for the sake of these 4 images. Like an introduced insect, but potentially an indigenous insect. And the same thing was happening with the plants. There were introduced plants, there were indigenous plants. So on some level, our minds probably went into, oh, this doesn't belong here, or this is being introduced here, or how long has this been here, for example. So that's what I normally refer to as invasion ecology, which I admit is a terrible terminology. But and so on that note, what about indigenous culture? Because we've been mentioning that some of these plants and some of the insects are indigenous. And I'll come back to this one specific slide that is my way of sharing some thoughts that I have been lucky to share with an indigenous scholar colleague that has worked with me in the past. And so I will say that on his behalf, I think that he would highly highlight that every time that you see something that is indigenous, whether it's a bee or a flower, that you are seeing indigenous culture. And then maybe beyond pollination, it's the idea that the plant is interacting with the insect, or the other way around. Whether pollination actually happens, right? The idea that pollination would lead to a seed, would actually ended up helping the plant, and the plant will propagate and all that. There's still an interaction between a plant and an insect. And maybe that interaction does not lead to pollination as such. Maybe it was just the bee collecting a little bit of food without pollinating, or maybe it was the bee collecting a little bit of nectar just to feed, so there's different types of interactions between plants and insects that occur at the flower that are not necessarily pollinated related. And then just finally, the black and yellow patterns that the few of you obviously mentioned. So that's really great. And of course that was done on purpose. I think you could develop these 4 types of slides in any kind of arrangement and patterns, but I just chose that one because they relate to bees, of course. So excellent. So thanks for that. So very quickly, before I introduce the Pollinator Observatories, just sort of like imagine this slide. It looks pretty complicated, but I just want you to think about this idea that when you're in a city, these interactions that we've been looking in the slides happen somewhere. They happen in what I normally refer to as a green space or a park, a garden, anywhere that you can think of where these things might happen, alongside the road, in the local heathland reserve. So yeah, just imagine that depending on how that reserve, that site, that green space looks, different types of interactions happen. And so it's very likely that a big reserve, can only imagine in Bayside what's happening inside those big golf course areas, must be very different than what happens in a small, tiny reserve. But who knows, maybe the reserve has more indigenous plants, and so it fosters better and more connected interactions than a big, massive lawn. So that kind of arrangement is really interesting to think about how it influences these ecological interactions between bees and plants and bees. And then that leads to then me just arranging this in a way that I thought was neat, kind of like you can see the dimensions as you move here. I'm moving the arrow. So when you think about the plants, then you move from something that is introduced to indigenous, and the same thing with the bees here. And it actually depends, the management actions that we do, and with this it could be anything, decisions that we make in our garden, what plant I'm going to plant tomorrow. Is it going to be an indigenous plant? Is it going to be a shrub? Is it going to be a tree? Is it going to be a tiny succulent? Those actions, all the way from our gardens to our reserves to the big city level changes that are happening across the whole region, will play a role in shaping these interactions here. And so some people might argue that we should be looking at the indigenous intersection, right, to foster this interaction here. But inevitably, other people in their gardens are going to be planting South African species. And then this interaction here, it's interesting to mention that it's between a South African daisy or daisy-related plant and a South African introduced species, bee. So that's funny. South African interaction happening right here in our back door. But obviously, potentially more strange is the idea of thinking of these other two, right? Like what happens when our native indigenous species start using things that we normally consider weeds? Does that make the weed a bad thing? Do we need to remove them? And so in doing so, aren't we not helping the native bee that actually uses that weed? And then the opposite here, right? Like you have a Banksia, and the Banksia and many other plants used by the common European honeybee to produce honey with an Australian plant. I'll find that fascinating. So just keep this in the back of your mind there, what we saw before with the slides and this game of interactions here. And maybe that will help you think about some of the things I would like to share with you today. Now then, that brings me to the Pollinator Observatories idea. As I mentioned, my colleague Janet Bolither is here tonight. And it's brilliant that, to think that we can be meeting here virtually to discuss this project after this few years since we took on this idea. Blythe Vogel was a student that developed her master's as part of this project too. So the three of us, amongst other people, the Friends of Westgate Park and other colleagues of mine, worked to develop this idea. And it was really exciting. I met with Blythe this morning to discuss another project. So it's been a really interesting day for reconnecting with my Pollinator Observatories colleagues. So yeah, this project, I'll speak more about this project in a second, but it's probably worth mentioning that it was developed in Westgate Park. I hope some of you are familiar with Westgate Park. It's a beautiful park, really worth knowing about and visiting. They've done a fantastic job at promoting indigenous biodiversity. And through this project, we're very successful at learning about their pollinators. And we found all kinds of interesting things that I'm going to share with you tonight. And so I think that the main idea that we wanted to develop this, and where like probably this project took wins, was just a simple idea of giving people opportunity to see insect pollinators in action. Now that's kind of like the original idea. Now it turns out that we have learned much more about anything that visits flowers. Of course, we were looking at flowers, looking for pollinators, and we have learned about pollinators, and we have learned about a whole bunch of other insects that actually also visit flowers. Now, one of the main challenges that we thought this project would imply would be to, how are we going to make people appreciate the benefits? So we would need to make those interactions tangible to people, and that's not an easy thing. It's easier said than done. You have to appreciate bees, you have to look for flowers, but they're tiny, they're small. So it's a challenge. And I'm sure most of you will appreciate that insects are small, they're fast, and that's just one word that we like to use. They're elusive. They're there, but they're not there. You have a really quick glimpse of them, then they fly away. Most people tend to say, I saw that, what was that? I couldn't see it, I can't remember anymore. It looked like a fly, it looked like a bee. Maybe that's different for some of the more charismatic butterflies, but they're quite elusive. So what we thought was, let's use the flowers, our plants. That's something that's more easy to understand. We know where they are, we know when they flower. Let's look at them to anchor our attention. And that's basically what this whole project is about. It's about trying to foster that moment of attention, of mindfulness, of, like it's about looking at the flower for minutes sometimes, and really enjoying that moment. And then magically, more often than not, in my case, they come. You just sit quietly around the flower, 5 minutes sometimes, 10 minutes if you need to. That elusive insect that you want to see will come to the flower, and it's a magical moment. So it's what we're trying to foster, is that moment of interaction by being mindful and relaxed and conscious of the interactions that are going to happen. And so, yeah, the idea in the case of Westgate Park, the original idea, so to speak, was to develop a network of flowering plants across the park, and then follow up, really thoroughly explore what kind of interactions were occurring on each one of those plants. And so that was the idea, a place where you could observe pollinators and other type of flower visiting insects. Now that idea has kind of morphed and changed into different things, and I'll share with you a little bit more towards the end. I'm sure also Janet will be really interesting to see some of the ideas that how things have changed. And so this is just an example. So you can imagine it could be, in any one of our Bayside reserves, there might be a patch of a plant species, say in this case, the storkbill here. This is one of our plants here in Bayside. I'm absolutely pretty sure that we have it here as an indigenous plant. And this is so in this case, this is Blythe Vogel, by the way, the master's student doing her thesis in action. So she's taking some kind of more formal observations for her research. And the rest of the people are citizen scientists that participated in workshops about pollinator observatories. They were trained to identify some pollinators, and they did these observations to contribute. And I'll show you what they contribute a little bit in a second. So here you have the 12 plant species for Westgate Park. So as you can see, a mix of forage, shrubs, trees, different colors, different locations in the park to foster people moving and exploring different sections of the park. Most importantly, as some of you will probably have kind of grasped quickly, these flowers, these plants flower through different moments of the year, right? So what we were hoping for is that it doesn't matter what time of the year you go to the park, at least some of the observatories would be in full flower for people to enjoy, to be able to make observations. And they were representative of the beauty and the diversity of flowering plants in Westgate Park. And again, I believe that we have potentially all of this plants here in Bayside, if I'm not mistaken, but feel free to comment if that's not the case. And so here's just another example. So in this case, it's a tree, an acacia, a wattle. and the group of, in a different workshop, then a different group of citizen scientists conducting the observations after the training. And this is just to highlight that in the case of Westgate Park, we did both research and citizen science observations. We wanted to be able to compare. We wanted to be able to see, should we do it just with research? No, that's kind of not really engaging the community. Let's try to do both and see what happens. Okay, and so in the end, imagine we have been doing this, I should have mentioned, for 2 years, doing research observations every month, doing seasonal workshops with the community every so often. So, and with all the data, everything that we collected, we could build these then network of plant pollinator interactions. And that kind of, you can probably understand now why I show you that slide about interactions, because actually now we have it. We know what interactions occur, at least in the pollinator observatories in Westgate Park. So let me explain the figure quickly. You probably gather that here in green, you have different indigenous plants. And then in blue, hopefully you would have noticed that these are your indigenous pollinators. And then in purple, just to highlight the difference, the non-indigenous or introduced insects, which you probably all know, honeybee, cabbage white, and a European wasp. And so you get a sense of, just by having a very quick glance, you can see that it's good. There were more indigenous interactions happening in blue and green, but there was a big component. Basically, even if you're not trying to provide for these introduced insects, those interactions are still happening. So, and that will take us back to that slide with the dimensions of what kind of interactions actually happen. So in other places, it's worth mentioning that they have explored this using a mix of introduced introduced and indigenous plants. And that tells obviously a different story. But in this case, we only had indigenous plants. And I suspect we have the blue banded bee up here. So it's a good moment to introduce the blue banded bee and see that not many interactions for blue banded bees and quite selective. So there's only 3 or 4 lines. So the blue banded bee is an example of an insect that does not interact with everything. It's very selective, whereas you get something like the honeybee interacting with almost everything. So that's also an interesting story. And then conceptually, this brings us to the idea, one of the original, so to speak, ideas or visions for the Pollinator Observatory project was that with time, if you kept doing this, I can imagine someone doing this in his or her garden say every week, or someone, a community group doing this in their local reserve every month. With time, and this is something that luckily we sort of have, right? We like doing this, we like making observations. If we went about it in a way that after a few years, we would know exactly when these pollination interactions are going to happen. And you could be able to tell people about it. So you could say, I want to see the Capra white. I want to see the Capra white this year. That's something that I would love to see. How can I go about it? I'm going to go to this park because I know she's there. I want to go in, say, October, because I know that's when she might fly through the city. But I want to go in a sunny day when the eggplant is flowering. And that's the best moment to see it. So we would have a really good knowledge to be able to be more predictive about how to see these interactions. Excellent. So what I might do is have a little pause here, and maybe Sally could let me know if there's any questions or any comments that we might want to share at this time before I go on.
Okay. Fantastic photographs, Lewis. Really beautiful. Now, I suppose, are you going to look at whether there was any finding as to why pollinators come out when it's warm and sunny?
Yeah, that was part of, we tried to document ideally exactly how the temperature and other factors when we were doing the observations to be able to say that. So that would be the optimal point to actually also have a sense of what kind of temperatures and what range of even wind speeds I think would be very important, especially in Bayside. I've noticed how strong the wind is and how strong an effect it plays on the vegetation. So yeah, that would be a good thing to know.
Right. And so is it just that they come out in much greater numbers when it's warm and sunny?
It's something that is well known about insects, that they need a little bit of, some of them need some heat, some warmth. So it's always a good thing. And then again, the wind plays a critical role. If it's too windy, they might be shy about it. If it's a cold morning, if it's raining. So all the environmental factors definitely play a role. I'm learning though, and this is something that just a comment anecdotally that I would love to share with the Bayside group, is that I have noticed here in Bayside that the winters have some very distinct hot days. And I'm finding that in those hot days, it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of winter, the insects will come out, especially if they're consecutive or they have some kind of time lag, like if it's been warm for a month, for a week. So there must be something in the insects that can cue to that warmth, even in winter, and generate small populations, because I've been seeing butterflies all throughout winter. And it's a very unique thing. I don't think it happens as often in other parts of the city.
Right. Okay. So we've got a question from Virginia. How can we as enthusiasts help pollinators?
Oh, so many ways, yeah. But like of the one that I would, to not make a very long answer to that, I would just go for the planting plants. That's the key thing they need. They want flower resources, as many as they can get. So yeah, and I will argue that, not to say that it's the only way to go, but for indigenous pollinators, indigenous plants seem to be the key resource.
Right. And Rosa asks, do the pollinators need food all year round? And do they need to travel very far to find their specific food plants?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll say, yeah, they need to feed for sure. Some of them need to feed themselves. Some of them need to bring the food back to their brood, or bring back the food to their cavities or nests or burrows. So yeah, food is essential resource. And when it's lacking, there'll be problems. But the ground is also very important. So they need to be ground to build nests and build burrows. And the distant thing is incredible. Again, I believe that that's highly dependent, as an ecologist would say, right? So apologies for that, but it depends. So I think that there are some species that are very good at flying all around and dispersing very long distances. The honeybee, without a doubt, it's probably the one that does it the best. And I think the smaller the species, so like a very tiny little indigenous bees that we have, are going to they're going to be by necessity more local. So they're going to probably emerge very close to the plants that they use. And if the plant is not there, they're going to struggle.
Mm-hmm. And blue-banded bees are a great favourite, it seems, Lewis. And we've got a question from Caroline as to how long do they stay in their burrows?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'll have to get back to you on that one, because I know very little about that part of the story. Unfortunately, it's proportional. There's so much more literature on what's happening on the flower than what's happening at home for bees. So yeah, I don't know the answer myself.
But maybe you could explain buzz pollination, which is what blue-banded bees do.
Yeah, sure. There is different techniques to extract or collect the pollen from different plants, from the side of the bee, of course, and then from the side of the plant, probably thousands of more. So plants have even more ways of providing pollen to insects, as you all know. I was playing with a trigger plant this afternoon here. It just has, my first trigger plant in my garden has two little flowers, and I was showing my son how to trigger the stamens to knock over. So it's, yeah. So buzz pollination is just one of those ways, and it just consists of vibrating the head really quickly to be able to, as the word implies, to bust the pollen out of the flower. So not every insect or not every bee can do that. There's very few, including blue-banded bees, but also outside of, well, in Tassie and other places, bumblebees will also do that.
Right. So given that some use buzz pollination, does that mean that they go to certain sorts of flowering plants?
That's what I originally thought. And one of the things that we found precisely in the Pollinator Observatory Westgate Park study was that while blue-banded bees started the year around this time where Dianella, the flax lilies, are start to flower. So yeah, the blue-banded bee will bust pollinate, say, Dianella during October, maybe November, but then Dianella goes out of flower. And then what we found in Westgate Park precisely was that blue-banded bee then goes to other types of flowers. So the story is not just, it's the capacity to bust pollinate, of course, but she definitely uses other type of flowers that don't need to be bust pollinated. And so again, the question is she actually just collecting things, or is she actually pollinating other than the flax lily? We don't know. It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And do bees favor certain colored plants?
I will say absolutely yes, but just with the caveat that they don't see color the way we do. So it might be that when you think that you have made a connection, a bee is going only to yellow flowers. It's yellow for us. It might be 3 different colors for the bee. So I don't know, an example, the Dianella might look purple to us and the bee, but maybe the geranium looks green to the bee and purple to us. And we make the false assumption that she's going to geranium because geranium is purple. So there's different visions going on inside the bee's mind.
Wow. Okay. And one question here about the effect of insecticides. So Caroline wants to know, are the backyard bees safe with so many people still using insecticides, and their honey, is it safe? Oh, I think from being polluted with this insecticide.
Well, yeah, of course, there is thresholds to everything. What makes us sick would be what we accept as standard things. You know, it's nothing is fully non-polluted. I hope we all understand that there's always little traces of pollutants and everything. But so maybe the threshold for humans is like, oh, that's a perfectly safe garden. I'm not using that much insecticides. And for an insect, it's terrible. You're actually completely polluting your garden for depending on what species. So I will argue that the smaller the species, the more likely that you can safely say that if you use insecticides, you're doing damage to that species.
Right, okay. So it could, the use of insecticides in people's backyards could affect backyard beehives, for example?
I'll say yes. Yeah, even in the case of honeybees, it's safe to say that the pollutants will be carried through the hive and just transfer to the whole colony.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question from Rosa. How important are weeds to bees?
Well, yeah, that question does not have an absolute answer, of course. They play a role, as we saw. We saw the image, we saw the comments. It's common knowledge that bees will extract resources from what we call weeds, just because they're a flower and they have resources. So yes, it's like a free meal. It's there. I'm gonna, from the bee point of view, it's something good. So I think it's all a matter of perspective. The importance for the bee, it might be a good thing that there's more things, more flowers, because some things are missing too. We have removed so much of our indigenous vegetation that there's space for the weeds to be there. So as long as there are resources, I think that's a good thing. That's all the trade-offs, of course, but I'm thinking from the bee perspective.
Hmm. Okay, well, would you like to continue,
Yeah.
Lewis?
Yeah, that'll be great. Thanks for all those great questions. And I'll keep going and then we can come back to another session towards the end, if that's okay.
Yep.
Excellent. All right, well, talking about blue-banded bees, so I think there's about 10 slides. I'll go through them really quickly. They're just images, and I just want to show you some of the things that we found at Westgate Park. I went through them early on, and I'm positive all of these insects that I'm going to show are also here in Bayside. So just feel free to imagine that you're in your favorite place, wherever you might potentially see this flower, and imagine that you're seeing this insects here in Bayside. But yeah, so this is the blue-banded bee, of course, you know her. And just as an example, not in a flax lily, so she's not bus pollinating this particular plant. But definitely we learned in Westgate Park that she's really keen on this particular native geranium. And I love it because we have this native geranium around the foreshore. So I'm really keen on seeing a blue-banded bee. Actually, I haven't seen a blue-banded bee here in Bayside yet. So it's the right time of the year for doing it. If you have seen one already, please let me know. And if you have any ideas where I might find her, then also let me know, because it would be great. And then leafcutter bees. I hope some of you know the leafcutter bee. Really interesting pollinator, not only because she goes to a range of indigenous plants, but she also is a herbivore. So at the same time, she cuts leaves, technically, and brings them back to help with her nesting and other resources. So a herbivore and a pollinator at the same time. Fascinating bee, native bee, indigenous bee. And then sweet bees are very, very dominant. And it's also because there's so many different species. So this is one of those things that I always mention. It's one of those things where like it's left at that. It's a sweet bee, but it's very difficult to identify them, especially on the wing. So I might raise that question of how do you feel? Is that enough knowledge? If we just say, here's a whole bunch of sweet bees, I'm happy to call them this genus, or do we actually really want to know what species it actually is and how important that is? Because to do that, then you will have to collect it, kill it, bring it back to a lab, pin it, show it to an expert, and then good. Oh, now I have a name, but so what? You have killed a bee. So what is the trade-off there, right? This research we conducted in Westgate Park, at least from the side of the pollinators, was without killing a single bee. We did it by observations. There was another component that we did a little bit of sweep netting, but I have moved and my colleagues to really just trying to observe things and not collect. But the trade-off is we can't tell you most of the times what some species are. And then I hope of you have seen this. These are smaller pollinators too, but they're masked bees, and you can see why they all have this very distinct kind of like yellow pattern against black that I find really, really interesting and helps with identification. But again, same problem with species potentially. I'm talking about on the wing when you're seeing them out there. Maybe with a photo, things can change because you have more time to identify things. And then moving from bees, what we learned in Westgate Park is there's a lot of wasps also going to flowers. In Westgate Park, at least, this one flower wasp was quite dominant. A big, larger species, a much better flyer, and could become really like this species. Like when a shrub was flowering, you would see 10 or 20 flower wasps really actively collecting pollen and going about. So it was fascinating to see something that it was not a bee being such a flower connected species. And then ants were very, very ubiquitous too. So as you can see here, it's not trivial. They're not just walking about and happen to go along the flower. They actually do go in there and collect resources. So again, an example of something that traditionally you wouldn't consider a pollinator. But we definitely know that if you observe flowers for a long time, for enough time, it's likely that you will see an ant come into it. So yeah, maybe next time that you see an ant in a bush that is flowering, just wait a minute, follow it, and see whether you can see that moment where she actually goes to collect resources from the flowers. And then the world of flies, which I'm going to show you how important they are in a second. So many indigenous flies that we have, and they're so very beautiful too. So again, this is that moment of kind of like science communication, how you, and if you have ideas, please let me know, how you convey the ideas that flies are important. That's a challenge for me, and something that I try to discuss as much as I can with other people. You know, bees, that's great, but there's so many indigenous flies that are doing similar things, potentially pollinating, collecting resources, probably doing other things at the same time. So multitasking in the insect world. And generally we don't consider him as much. So there's a barrier to be broken there. But I feel at least some of you tonight will remember the green butterfly, and very common here in Bayside too. And then of course hoverflies, which I argue are only charismatic because they resemble bees. They're mimicking bees, and in their own way they have kind of like build their little niche space in the insect world by looking like a bee. But also fascinating insect, and just the ability of hover as they do is something that is just worth doing. And so with hoverflies, it's kind of cool because when you're doing the Pollinator Observatories activities, you can actually point them out very quickly. Oh, there's a hoverfly, because they're just hovering around. So you can just follow that hovering until they actually see them slowly landing. And that really helps the interactive, the engagement component of it, being mindful of the hoverfly hovering towards the flower. And then I was recently asked by a group of people who were trying to figure out what would be Australia's ambassador to the insect world. So if we had to nominate an insect to represent Australia globally, what would that be? And so, yeah, again, if you have ideas, let me know in the chat, or let's discuss them in the chat. Because they were proposing all kinds of things, as you can expect. And I nominated the harlequin bug, just because I think it's a beautiful species. The color patterning is incredibly beautiful. And again, a species that is capable of doing social behaviors that are not that common outside of bees and ants and other groups. And a species that would walk on the ground, but also walk along the branches, the twigs, but also go to flowers, as you can see here. And so the question that I'm trying to find out is this capacity of pollen to be attached to the legs and the beak of this bug here is at least one of the signs of potential cross-pollination. Where other groups might be on the flowers, they don't collect the pollen. But this species is definitely collecting pollen, as the photo shows. So it'll be really interesting to know whether she's also capable of pollinating. And by the way, I haven't seen this one in Bayside yet. So I wonder if you have, also let me know, thanks. And then just an example of another very common bug. And here what I always mention is, if some of you know this bug and you mention this name, say in government, it's a pest. That's what comes to mind. It's a pest, it's bad for our crops, it's damaging our plants at massive scales when we have big monocultures outside of cities. But here in cities, it's completely a plant that's causing no harm, comes to flowers, collect resources, potentially pollinating. It's food for other animals. So it's a perfectly beneficial insect. So I also struggle, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this kind of imbalance between us nominating things as pests when they're actually completely potentially beneficial, or at least not, they're harmless in the context of cities. So yeah, that's another thing that we have to kind of like learn how to communicate better when we give them these talks, because everyone has their own points of view, and it's challenging. And then just very quickly, there are other things. There are beetles that you can see here. And going into the butterflies, you have your skippers and your little blue butterflies. And then moving into the introduced species, the cabbage white, which is a very common species here in Bayside too, I've noted. And then things like the European wasp. And of course, the European honeybee, which is very common, very, very common species everywhere. Now, having shown you that was also for you to get a sense of what these next few plots, kind of like our findings for Westgate Park, mean. And very briefly, I just want to show you, highlight some key things. I wonder whether you thought it makes sense that the European honeybee was the species where we found most of our interactions happening. So up to 20% of all the interactions that we saw came from the honeybee. But then next we jump to flies, a group that is fully indigenous. So there's no introduced species here. So then again, that's what I was saying, like after the introduced bee comes flies, and then another introduced species, and then we go to the hoverfly, which is also a fly. So if you believe this data that we found, welcome to be skeptical, but I will say that it's a really clear sign that native bees, at least, were playing this role down here. Still 10% of all interactions as compared to other groups, but flies and hoverflies were more dominant in this story. And then just very quickly up here, just to show you how important were the contributions of citizen scientists to all this data that we collected. So almost 40% of all the observations came from citizen scientists. So the story would have not been complete, obviously, if we hadn't thought of the benefits of not only engaging the community for the community engagement benefits, but also to provide an opportunity for them to provide data to this study. And so again, this is just when you group things, not at species level, but at kind of big insect group level. So between European honeybees and native bees, they're still the dominant group, but barely when you combine hoverflies and indigenous flies. So they're right there, equally important. And then I just highlight here very just quickly the introduced species. You probably already knew which ones they were. And then just to show you that when we remove the introduced species interactions, it's very clear that flies are dominating the story here. And so I think that's a fascinating story. But again, it shows the complexity of the next steps here. How are we going to become better at identifying flies on the wing to be able to reflect that diversity that most commonly is associated with bees? You saw that. I could only show you a couple of fly examples, whether I myself was really more capable of showing you about bee diversity. So how can we change that story to start communicating more about other groups, flies and bugs and other things? And then probably importantly, the other part of the story then is the plants. So here are the 12 observatories in Westgate Park. And if you were thinking that they all played an equal role in this story, but that's clearly not the case. So you actually have champion plants that are capable of attracting more pollinators in this story. So in relative value, in relative numbers, then you have something like the daisy bush capable of attracting 70% of all the different species or groups that we saw in Westgate Park. The one plant, if you combine that then with the stork's-bill, then imagine the power of these three, or there's 4 plants to attract that. But then it also shows a selection thing. If you were to then randomly or by your own preferences choose this specific watchel and this postman in your garden, then it's unlikely, at least in the area of Westgate Park that we explore, that you will be able to attract all those pollinators. And this story is happening in every single space that you can imagine. It happens in Bayside, it will happen in the Dandenongs, it will happen in whenever, everywhere. There's a group of plants that are better at attracting at this stage or in this day and age, given present circumstances with the whole very human dominated environments that we have. So, but they're still capable of attracting more efficiently the pollinators that we are hoping to see. So plant selection plays a key role. And then just coming back to then our plot with the interactions then, it's a way of showing that we can learn from the plot and we can learn from the story that I told before, who is interacting with whom. And so if you really want to concentrate on blue-banded bees, then you can follow those stories and know exactly what plants the blue-banded bee is interacting, and use that knowledge to inform your gardening practices, the plants that you promote or advocate that should be planted in your local reserve, in your school, in whatever you decide to do plantings. And that goes for every group that you see here. Now, the opposite story is quite difficult because the cabbage white and the honeybee are such a generalist group that they go to anything. So you basically will have to acknowledge too, that no matter what you try to do, no matter how selective you try to be with your indigenous plants, or your indigenous insects, it's very unlikely you're going to prevent attracting introduced insects. So just a quick plot. I'm really happy to talk to you with this if you want to more detail one-to-one or through the chat later on, but just very quickly to show you that this story repeats itself in this study that I'm showing you here. It goes beyond pollinators. It goes to every kind of insect group. There's almost 600 different insect species in this one study that I'm showing you. And then I just want to bring you really quickly to blue, where it's the indigenous plants that were part of the study, and see how both lilioids, shrubs, and graminoids, indigenous tussock grasses that you're familiar with, are incredibly better at attracting insects than, say, introduced lilioid. Might have a massive flower, might be beautiful if you want to give it to someone, but it's not helping insects as your graminoids would. So we made a very strong case for the use of indigenous plants here. And that's the type of kind of research that gets me excited, is to demonstrate this kind of benefits for insects of specific group of plants. And here's the story about indigenous culture. So in this article that you're all welcome to share and read, you can find it online. It's making the case for indigenous plants from the indigenous culture perspective. And so my indigenous colleagues of this paper, that's what got them excited. Is that it's so exciting that you and your colleagues are showing that indigenous plants are good for insects. That's great. They argue and advocate that every time that we bring an indigenous plant into the city, we are helping indigenous culture for many, many reasons that I invite you, that they advocate for in the paper. So you can hear it from them if you're keen to read more about that in this piece. And then very, very quickly, just to show you a little bit really quickly of how, in Janet's words, the Pollinator Observatory idea has cross-pollinated across other councils, other areas. So presently we have variations. There's not the same. That's the most interesting part. There's variations of the idea happening in Moorland, in Glenera, in Greater Dandenong, and in Whitehorse. This is an example of an event, type of event run from Glenera Council at Riponlea, which is not that far from here, at least where I am. And yeah, but at Riponlea, of course, it's done completely on introduced plants. So it has a different flavor to it. It's more about promoting not the plants as such, but promoting the idea of people wanting to look for these interactions, to explore more than the birds at the park, to get into the insect world. So that's why they call it the buck hunt. So it's a really interesting approach to kind of, for them, is helping them, for people to see insects. In this slide here in Moorland, the idea was more close to, they want to bring nature back, as the title of that article suggested. They want to bring nature back into Moorland. And what they mean by that is that the greening actions that they do, the new indigenous plants that they plant in, say, in this park here in Chills Reserve, they want to do it on purpose to attract things. So it goes beyond just the planting for the sake of the planting. Is let's do this plant to help us inform what plants we do that might attract some insects. So for them, the champion, again, the charismatic blue-banded bee was one of their kind of like things they were very excited about. So, and this was their idea of a pollinator observatory, to have some kind of like a stand, art, signage type thing happening here. And some other, if you could look closely, there's some art designed by the local school children on these kind of like seats on the ground. And the idea is to bring the local schools to sit here, read the signage, and then mindfully observe the pollinators interacting with the plants around this little pods, they call them. So for them, they're observation pods because they want to observe birds and other things. So it's kind of like an evolution of the idea. But the cool thing was they were really after attracting blue-banded bees. And so we went to this site before they changed it. So it was basically a very poor condition lawn and you know, some kind of shrubs and trees, a mix of things, but very little vegetation. And there were no blue-banded bees, basically no pollinators at all, except some exceptions and some weeds. Then they did the change, brought in the plants, follow our advice and other people's advice on what kind of things might attract the blue-banded bee. And I'm really happy to share with you that a year after, and I was working with them in a research capacity to help them demonstrate this. So it was a really cool collaboration because basically I was going to this park to take photos of insects just to be able to demonstrate what was coming back to the site. And that very first day that the goodenia flowered, the blue-banded bee was attracted to the site. And it's super exciting. I got the phone, I call council, I say it's happening, it's here, and they got super excited. And for them, it's just showing that it could work. It's possible to dream about things and make them happen. So I think that's a really cool evolution of the observatory idea. And on that note, I'm just going to finish with 3 slides taken here in Bayside in our local reserves around Sandringham and Beaumaris and Blackrock, just to show you that our pollinators are also around. And it's, so I hope in the future to be able to show you some more things, some more projects happening here locally. And yeah, so just to mention that this next 3 photos are part of a new project that I've started, which is about wildlife gardening. And so we wanna demonstrate that the plants that people can potentially acquire in the indigenous nurseries across different areas of Melbourne, what kind of insects, what kind of pollinators, what kind of flower visiting insects they should be expected to find in each given plant. So for the first time we have, I think we're aiming for over 100 different species, indigenous species, to have a full list of their pollinators across the whole year. So it's kind of ambitious, but it's very fun. And because of COVID, I make the decision to not travel, well, I can't travel to my other sites across Melbourne. So for all the COVID period, I've been just doing the observations here in Bayside, which means in the end, Bayside is going to have most of the observations. So it's kind of a cool turn of events. So yeah, I'll just say goodbye by that, and I'll show you the 3 slides, and then I'll stop. So that's the hoverfly in a wattle, and a sweet bee in another wattle, a more spiny one. I think this is from George Street Reserve. Some of you might be familiar with George Street Reserve. I'm sure all of you are familiar with George Street Reserve. And then my favorite so far, right by the foreshore, meters away from the bluff and the cliffs, where you find these sea figs or pigface, and they're full of this small little beautiful bee. An example of what's happening here in winter. So it's been really fun. Thank you so much, everyone. It's a pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, Lewis. We've got a little bit of discussion here about hoverflies. Apparently, Elizabeth has seen them, seagulls feeding on hoverflies, which was quite interesting.
Wow.
And there was also question, why do you think they hover? They seem to spend a lot of time just hovering and looking before they actually land on something, whereas some other insects seem to just land and then test out things, whereas the hoverflies seem to assess things before they actually dive down.
I'll promise to get back to you. See, like, this is what I love of these talks, that I end up finding all these interesting things to find out, but I don't have the answer to that. But I'm sure that someone has looked at that, and if not, it would be worth at least contemplating why. But what I do know is that insects have all kinds of different flying behavior. So, and of course, the hoverfly has one of the most distinct and beautiful flying approaches. So, but every it's probably important to know that every bee and every fly flies in a different way. So they're capable of doing incredibly interesting behaviors. Yeah.
Right. So someone also was asking whether native bees can hover.
I don't know. I don't think I've seen a native bee hovering. They seem to be more on the quick type of fly, like to approach flowers flying very quickly. In that sense, I almost say that a native bee is a better flyer. Blue-banded bees are probably amongst the best flyers that I ever seen in a bee. So the way they fly is, if you've seen her, incredibly accurate compared to like even the honeybee, for example.
Right. And there's a lot of people who's obviously found your talk amazingly interesting and very informative. I'm just trying to get to some of these questions, but they're scrolling up and down and I can't see them very easily at the moment. Sorry about that. There's a whole bunch of questions in the middle, which the scrolling is going straight past.
Sally, there's one question from Rosa. Have bees and insects increased or decreased in Bayside given all the developments on private blocks?
Oh, well, so yeah, so I'm not informed in this question any particular thing that I've read or any report or any kind of data, but I think it's safe to say that anywhere where there has been development, you can assume that at least locally where that development took place, there would be decreases, not only in bees, but decreases of everything. Yeah.
Thank you.
The theme, the topic of whether insects are declining, it's quite topical right now in the research world, at least. It's so many discussions about it because it's being very clearly assessed for other groups, for birds and mammals and frogs and other things. Whereas for insects, it's this massive uncertainty and there's a strong debate, a heated debate of whether it's happening or not. So I'll keep you informed, but I'm following those discussions as we speak. And there's not a consensus really. It's people, some might argue that insects are not declining. Some other people are arguing that the declines are quite impressive. So, but they don't seem to be in agreement on it.
Okay, and we have a question here whether blue-banded bees would use bee hotels.
Not that I know of, not specifically blue-banded bees, but maybe I would have to, there's people actually actively researching the benefits of bee hotels and insect hotels. And I think it's, they're finding it difficult to at least show the benefits that were once expected. So it was expected at some time that they were going to be really beneficial and they were going to be help. And I think increasingly I'm finding that people who were advocates of bee hotels and insect hotels are moving more cautiously now to suggest that as a way of complementing a properly established garden, yes, of course, but not a way of saying, oh, I'm not going to plant the indigenous plants or the plants needed for the indigenous bees, and I'm just going to solve that problem by having a bee hotel. So it's probably best to be cautious and err on the side of going for the plants and the nice ground as opposed to just relying on the bee hotel for blue-banded bees and any other bee.
Mm-hmm. And it's a question, what can our local Bayside Council do to help out our pollinators?
Oh, wow. Well, again, I think there was a similar question in the first break. What can I do, right? And so without going into there's so many dimensions of things that could be done, I would focus, just because of today's talk, on the planting side. So really putting effort into exploring what kind of plants would benefit our pollinators the best. And we're getting there. So for example, with that study that we're doing for wildlife gardening. So, but there's information out there. So the more plantings we can do, the better. and increase the diversity of plants, bring back those indigenous plants that are rare. That's one component. And as I probably mentioned today, I hope that was the message that I left, was if we don't make it tangible to people, no one is going to appreciate it. So I think that it has to run in parallel with people wanting to learn more about them. And that could create the effect that we want. Maybe they're there and we're just not seeing them. So we want to provide for pollinators. We want to provide opportunities for people to appreciate the pollinators.
Mm-hmm. And someone wants to know what sort of camera equipment you use.
Nothing fancy. It's an old digital camera and a macro lens, and that's it. So I just rely on the sun and taking the photo from the right angle so I can use enough speed to capture the moment.
And we have a question here. Are you helping Catherine Horsall study wildflower planting fields in Parkville?
Oh, no, I actually learned about that project recently. I used to live, very close to where that site is. And I'm really excited to go see it. I suppose in a way it's been informed by a previous sort of like really cool project that happened at the State Library of Victoria, where a grassland was brought in. Hopefully some of you saw it. And we did research on that site and demonstrated that even the installation, the plants only lasted for 5 weeks. And we showed that the amount of insects that were attracted to the site was incredible. So we've been showing that to like people around the world, that bringing grasslands into the city, it's really good. So I'm really happy and excited to see that project, but no, I haven't been involved in it. Mm-hmm.
We also have a question here about observation. Can you give us a few more details about how people should go about being systematic about observation?
Oh, yeah, of course. There's so many different ways. For example, one thing that really works, and it's true that I didn't mention it, just realizing it. Selecting the amount of time it's important. You could go for, say, I'm going to observe a flower or a plant flowering for some minutes. So that's a way of being systematic. You say, I'm going to do it for 1 minute, or I'm going to do it for 3 minutes, or 5, or 10. If you just are constant with that, it's very likely that you will increase your chances of seeing things, especially if you want to note it down or like do it across different months or different places. So just standardizing that amount of time that you look, it's really important. And then the second thing that really helps is having a period of sort of, how to put it? So divided in different stages. So you might say, instead of doing 10 minutes all at once, it's so much more better to do 4, 3, and 3, for example. Something as easy as that. So maybe in the 4 first minutes, you see the typical things that you're going to see, the honeybee, the butterfly, the big things who don't care that you're around, are going to go to the flower anyway. And then you restart the clock after 4 minutes, but you've been there already. You've been mindful. Your body stops. You start being this active. And then the more shy insects come in. So that's another way of guaranteeing that you get to see systematically some of the more interesting shy species. I hope that helps. But if you want to know more, I'm really happy to chat. And on that note, feel really free to use my details to get in touch. And I'm always happy to have chats and follow-ups.
Okay, thanks for that, Lewis. Couple more questions before we have to wrap up. Does blue-white artificial light, so artificial light in a blue-white end of the spectrum, does that affect the ability of pollinators to find flowers?
Oh, beautiful question. Another question that I might have to research into. I don't know, but definitely light will play a role. And again, it might affect the perception of color, the perception of marks on the flower that sometimes are in the ultraviolet range. But yeah, I don't know specifically whether blue-white light affects that. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's okay. We've been providing a bit of information on artificial lighting and how it affects wildlife in regards to often sporting grounds, and council has been trying to obtain some information about that from us. So if you ever find anything, that would be good to add to our knowledge.
It's probably something that you already know. It's affecting other groups like bats and birds and other things, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's probably about all we've got time for, and we might hand over to Anne.
Thank you very much, Sally. And thank you very much, Lewis. That was a great talk. As president of the group, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, there's lots of stuff we could do that we haven't been doing yet. So I think on our next committee meeting, we'll be discussing some of what you've talked about tonight and thinking about how we can apply it locally in various ways. Probably mostly once COVID's over, but we'll see what we can do in the short term. Anyway, thank you very much for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Now, tomorrow, actually just before I do that, I'd just like to share that so that people can see. We've got a nice little certificate we want to send to you. And I hope you can see that all right. And the other thing we're going to do, in case that hasn't, whoops, hang on.
Sorry, Anna. Anne, I don't
no,
think...
there it is. That's better.
Oh, there you go.
Yep.
Thanks.
So we'll get that to you. And the other thing we'd like to do is for you to keep an eye on your doorstep tomorrow.
Ta-da!
Oh, beautiful.
And you'll find that on your doorstep. I
Thank
believe it's all Indigenous. Is that right, Elizabeth?
Yes, you've got Courier and Bossier.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So definitely Indigenous.
From our native nursery.
Now, before I finish off the meeting, I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank Dennis Young. He's recently left our committee because of other commitments. He's been treasurer and an active committee member for several years. Most notably, he managed our water bowls project and looking after our water bowl volunteers. He helped us grow after we incorporated, and his ideas and efforts have contributed to our successes. We're already missing him, and I hope he'll be able to return should demands on his time reduce. Now, Dennis's leaving means we've got a vacancy on our committee. If you think you might, and this is to anyone, if you think you might like to help out, you probably have questions deciding before if you want to, whether you want to join our committee. Please send us an email and we'd be happy to have a chat and answer your questions. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along to our first online event. A special thank you to those who are able to help us offset the costs involved. And I've just realised I haven't turned on my video, which is very naughty of me. I'll get used to this eventually. It is our first online one. As I was about to say, this is our first online event. So there's likely to be ways that we could have improved what we did if we ever do it again, which we may or may not, we don't know yet. We'll be sending everyone a survey over the next few days so that you can easily tell us what we did right and how we can improve for next time. If you can find the time, it would be great to get your feedback. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. We hope to see you all at our next Wild in Bayside early next year. And when restrictions allow, we hope to also see some of you, if not all of you, at some of our outdoor events as well. Who knows when that'll be at this time, but we will be doing them again when we can. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. That was amazing.
Unmute and then you have to leave.